So you worked with a large team to bring this about, and several of them are your Trinity colleagues, Dr. Lawson Younger and Dr. Richard Averbeck, Dr. David Powell, our dean, Graham Cole, and Professor Dana Harris. Others
and Dr. Taylor Lau as well
contributed to this. So how does this team come together? How were they chosen? And what's the process for somebody writing some notes to getting it all together in a coherent fashion?
Well, the first step was Zondervan making the mistake of asking me, and me making even bigger mistake and saying yes, because it certainly involved more work and took more time than I had envisaged. It was a lot of work, and when I laid out, and initially they just asked me to do a Zondervan study Bible, and after thinking about it and praying about it and talking it over with them, I laid out the parameters in terms of length and focus on biblical theology and that sort of thing, if I were to be involved with it. And then I proposed the names of the associate editors, and they approved. And then the associate editors chose the team of 60 or 65 writers and contributors, and Zondervan approved again. They made a couple of suggestions along the line. One or two people had to pull out, or we pulled them out, as the case might be. And eventually then contracts were arranged in terms of deadlines and that sort of thing. And when the documents first came in, well, one of the interesting things about this study Bible, it's the first study Bible in the history of the universe that has been prepared without any paper. Well, now it has paper. But when we were doing the editing, everything was done electronically. There wasn't a scrap of paper anywhere. For shorter documents, we used Google Docs, and for longer things, when Google Docs choked, then we sent it all to Word and circulated it that way and so forth. And as you may well know, under those systems, in addition to your text, you can write comments in the margin. And if you're all on Google Docs, then all of the editors had coded passwords to get onto these Google Docs with a massive chart that showed where every document was in the system, with about 26 steps right across this way, and all the documents going down this way. And anytime we hit the next step, then the date was entered and so on. So you could watch as the chart filled up going right across. When a document came in, all 5 of the editors went through it. I was the last one. They had voluminous comments in the margins. And eventually, we got to know each other well enough that instead of just commenting on the text, they were also interacting with each other and making rude comments and funny jokes back and forth to each other, you see? And before it could be sent back to the writer, I had to clean them all up. You see? So I was the last one and adjudicated between the editors if they were disagreeing about something, and that sometimes involved back and forth, to and froing. You know, did you really mean that? Yeah, but what would he say? And it would go back and forth, and I'd make a final adjudication. Then it would all go back to the author, and then the author was expected to work through all our notes again. And those are comments, as we call them. And those comments were anything from content related to level of English, to the form not being right, to needing to get dates lined up with other dates, biblical faithfulness. They missed a biblical theological connection that we thought was just too important to duck, and you have to do something more on this area, have to shorten it down here. We said 30,000 words, you've given us 36, knock it down to at least 34, and all of this sort of thing, do you see? And eventually that all came back again. And except in disputed cases, that didn't go around all the editors. It came to 2 of us, and I was inevitably one of them. And eventually, when that was cleaned up, and sometimes that would go around 2 or 3 times, but when that was cleaned up, then it would go for copy editing within Zondervan. And so that would go through another range of editors, and that would all go back to the writers again. And when it came back to their copy editors, I saw it all again. In case there were disputes and that sort of thing. And when that was just about all ready for typesetting, then there was another review team put together by Zondervan that read it all again. And that went to one of their chaps. He's just recently gone to be with the Lord, a really brilliant scholar who was very helpful. He screened out most of what they said, and then the most disputed things came back to me, and I adjudicated again, and then it went off, and I never want to see another passage of it again. Now, I'm happy to use it, but I have no more editorial comments to make whatsoever. So that was the process, and then there was some proofing later on, but they hire professional proofers for that kind of thing.
So you've edited the major biblical theology series that InterVarsity Press is doing, now up to 37 volumes, and you're the general editor of the highly regarded Pillar Commentary series, which deals with study on the Greek text at the highest level. What's the difference between editing those works and editing work on the English Bible that's intended largely for lay readers?
Yeah, and I edited another thing called Studies in Biblical Greek, which is purely technical, and each of them are different envisaged readerships. Commentaries are much longer than the kinds of notes you have in a study Bible. The study Bible is pitched at a more popular level, and you're really very restricted by space as to how much you can say. Whereas a commentary is a full-orbed treatment of every significant word, clause, phrase, piece of syntax, sentence, paragraph. There are limits on how much you can say there, too. Commentaries can get too big to be useful, but a commentary is a bit different. The new studies in biblical theology, the closest parallel to it in the study Bible are the essays at the end. But those essays are 6 to 10 pages, that sort of thing. They're relatively brief, but there's a 6 to 10 page essay in there on the temple, for example. But we have a volume on the temple that's about 350 or 400 pages in the new studies in biblical theology. So those are meant to be major studies, pitched for pastors rather than for generally lay audiences. And there are a lot of lay people that read them and enjoy them, but they're studies for pastors and students and scholars. And the commentaries are for pastors and other serious readers of the Bible who are more mature and have worked their way through biblical texts before. This is really designed for lay people in a congregation, for popular consumption and Bible studies and house groups and that sort of thing.
So how do you decide when you're writing at that level when that the notes should survey various interpretations, some of the hard sayings of Jesus, Romans chapter 7, Hebrews chapter 6, Revelation 20, some of the classic passages where there are multiple interpretations? How do you keep from that becoming a commentary and still provide something that's helpful enough that people can understand the challenges?
Well, we just decided we'd tell the truth. No, I mean, it's a serious question, and it's not easy to answer. There are 2 or 3 questions bound up with it. You have to decide which issues need a little more treatment. That's one thing. And that's determined partly by their importance within the biblical canon and partly by their importance in our culture. So if we're dealing with a passage that is saying something about homosexuality, I want to make sure the bases are covered today. If there's something about eschatology, there are enough disputes amongst Christians about last things that you've got to say something about those sorts of things as well. So there are enough critical issues out there that people bring home from university lectures and reading Richard Dawkins and other people. You have to say something about those kinds of things too, while still remembering that at the end of the day, this is an introduction. This is not the final word. There is a second factor. You want to allow the contributors you've asked enough space to give their own slant on things, but not so much space that they exclude people who disagree with them. I won't mention any particular names. I won't mention even which biblical book, but one particular biblical book, we gave it to someone that I thought would be suitable. I had mentioned his name. And the first draft came back, and he took a particular stance with respect to this book that was very hard-nosed. It was his particular stance. I knew it was his stance going in. He'd written a commentary on the book, but we had laid out in the guidelines and so on how even-handed you've got to be and so on. So we sent back voluminous criticisms and suggestions, and he came back and was scarcely improved. So we pulled a contract on him. He got some partial payment, but we had very carefully worded all of the contracts to say that the editors, which ultimately means me, had final say. And we just could not have something that was as hard-nosed as that. So the chap we got to write that particular book afterwards, he has some strong views himself, but he was so even-handed that you'd probably be hard-pressed to discern exactly what his views were. There's a danger of going the other side, of course, and making everything sound so flexible and open-ended that you're not allowed to take any odd interpretations anywhere. But on some disputed matters, what we did was we took on writers whom we knew took different stances. So, for example, we have some strongly complementarian writers, and we have some strongly egalitarian writers. And what we discovered is we had to rein both of them in. In other words, don't milk your passage too far in that direction. Now, you can argue your corner, but the balance of our study Bible is often in the accumulation of different authors doing their bit. But even then, we've sort of reined them in to make sure that they don't overstate their own slant and position. So all of those devices and stances were there.